In our interview segment tonight, we're talking again to renowned economist John Taylor. Last night, we spoke with Professor Taylor about the world economy and his outlook for recovery. Tonight, we concentrate on the IMF. From 2001 to 2005, he was responsible for oversight of both the IMF and the World Bank for the White House. And he had previously called for the IMF to be abolished in the wake of a string of national economic crises from Mexico to Russia in the 90s. I spoke with him recently about the IMF and its growing role in the world. As Undersecretary for International Affairs, you represented the White House with the IMF. Yet at one point in your career, you called for the IMF to be abolished, saying it was doing more harm than good. I'm curious what your current opinion is of the IMF.
I think there's been a great deal of improvement since the late 90s and the crisis period. We had 8 years of crises, starting with Mexico and actually continuing through Argentina and Uruguay, and of course Eastern Central Europe, part of that period, Russia. So it was not a good time, but since then the IMF has become clear about its approach to intervention. It's laid out a exceptional access framework that I think has been very clear and an improvement. And in fact, for the most part, emerging market countries have fared much better since 2002-2003 when the IMF made some of these changes. In fact, given the hit to the world economy, it's quite remarkable that Brazil, India, etc. have fared so well. Now, I think in some sense, one of the exceptions is Eastern Central Europe here. And if I look at it, and of course you can't generalize too much, but it seems to me that some of the lessons, borrowing in foreign currencies, not watching the reserve levels, those were addressed in many emerging market countries, but less so in Central Europe. And so I think to some extent that's why you've seen in this crisis more of the problems focused in your part of the world.
Let me follow up on a point you made, because you wrote in 2002 that, quote, countries themselves, not the U.S., not the G7, not the IMF, have ownership over their own policies. Now, interestingly, in a visit last month, the head of the IMF delegation to Romania was asked by the press what specific steps the government should take here to fix the country's budget. He said it was up to the government to decide, but he prefaced the answer by saying, quote, within reason, it's left to the government to decide. Are you surprised by his response?
Well, I don't know all the details of that. I would just say that I think the philosophy of, in a democracy, the countries making their own decisions, having ownership, and of course, you just got to distinguish a little bit between some things that are clearly purely internal, whether you have a particular government program or not, or whether you have a welfare program or not. There's nothing international there. But I think some things are international, and therefore they need to have more of a discussion with the IMF or other decision international bodies. But I think, from what I hear from that quote, the main message should be that decisions about a budget and how you balance it are best left to the country. Then there's the ownership, and the leadership in the country is responsible, and they can't point fingers at some external group and get in the blame game. I think it's a healthier situation.
Well, that's a good introduction to my next question. This is an election year in Romania, and I'm wondering, you might be able to imagine what's occurring here as it tries to rectify the budget with threats of strike. Any advice for an emerging market facing recession, dealing with the IMF, while at the same time facing great opposition? You've certainly seen similar situations in other countries in the past.
Seen it in every country. It's always an issue about, I'd say just as a rule, I think, to me, good economics is almost always good politics, especially if it's explained properly. I think the idea of a government living within its means is appealing to a broader public, and the idea of a government not making the tough decisions, if you like, is not appealing. It has to be explained properly. It's not easy. I don't want to say it's a simple point to get across, but by and large, you look at history, and the countries that are, I think, following good economic policies are doing well, and people want to do well. They want to be prosperous. So that's what I would focus on, and anything that requires tough decisions like a budget deficit, those can be laid out, do it gradually, be credible about it, be convincing, and I think it'll appeal to a lot of people.
Looking ahead, one of your primary recommendations for the IMF was to set limits and stick to them. In 2007, you called for the organization to be, quote, more deliberative and predictable. You pointed out that the inconsistencies at the IMF led to the Russian crisis in 1998, which people in Romania would remember well from the so-called contagion. Given that call for predictability, has the IMF been more predictable, extending forbearance on a lesser or more rational scale? Or how have they gone toward what you've recommended?
Well, I think there's an improvement, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, in 2003, they instituted an exceptional access framework that did indicate the conditions under which they would provide exceptional access. And I think that's created a better environment for countries to make decisions. That predictability is one of the reasons so many countries have built up their own reserves, tried to deal with the currency mismatches, borrowing in foreign currencies. And so I think it's been good. And of course, again, I'd say that the homegrown crises from emerging market countries have really diminished completely since 2002, 2003. And even more than that, the externally driven crises, such as we've just gone through, which have hit large countries like Romania very hard, the resilience is much more than you would have expected during the period when the IMF was much less predictable and uncertain about what it was doing. I mean, nothing's perfect, and I do have quite problems with the massive expansion of resource availability at the IMF, but just the fact that the amounts of loans outstanding are much less now, given this world crisis we've had, much less than they were in the emerging market crises in the 90s and early part of 2002, 2003, is quite remarkable.
Now, there are plenty of models out there, country models, for what not to do. Do you have one or two examples that you can point to of countries that have gotten it right?
Having done it right, well, I thought you were going to ask me about wrong, but, you know,
well, I thought there might be too many to have gotten it wrong.
Well, I think recently, no, I think in the case of the developed economies, the United States, I think we did get off track with respect to our monetary policy, and we got more interventionist than in the past, and I think that's part of the problems right now. I think to some extent you've seen that a little bit in Europe, although not as much. On the other hand, the emerging market countries, with seems to me few exceptions, have been doing it basically right. And again, there's specific exceptions that I don't want to go too far in this direction, but it seems to me that we have a tremendous learning opportunity here in this crisis to see countries that sort of didn't do the right policy have led to problems, and things haven't worked so well, and countries that have. And I mean, you could compare Brazil now versus 10 years ago. The biggest economy in Latin America, one of the so-called BRIC economies. It's done very well. It's under the Lula administration economically, and I think you can see the policies, and I think they're very proud of it. And then it's just sticking in our hemisphere here. We have seen the United States hasn't done so well in this latter period, and hopefully we're going to do a lot better. But there's a lot of evidence there for people that want to take a look.
Don't miss the full half-hour interview with Mr. Taylor this weekend, Sunday afternoon at 12:30 here on the Money Channel. When we come back, we'll take another look at the effect of the strengthening lei. A strong currency sounds good, but is it? We'll also give you a look at a few companies reacting to the markets around the world in different ways, and we'll have our glimpse ahead on Wednesday. We'll be right back.